Ryzen 3000, it's been causing a storm of hype in the tech world for ages now because of its promised increased performance and other key features such as the advertised game cache and other cool stuff like support for PCIe Gen 4. Well, they're here and I have one, and it's finally time to get into exactly what you get in this little box. So let's put this to the test and see what exactly my Ryzen 7 3700X can do. But here's an issue. I don't have a i9 9900K just lying around for me to benchmark and put against my 3700X. So for those kind of comparisons, I'll be using online benchmarks that have already been done. However, I'll be bringing something of my own to the table, and that's comparing this to my old CPU I'm upgrading from, an FX 8350. Yes, that's right, the 8-core 8-thread beast is once again making a return, and I'll be putting it up against my Ryzen. So first, let's go over our benches. I'll be bundling my FX 8350 with an Asus M5A 97 motherboard, 16GB of DDR3, 1600MHz RAM, and a GTX 1080 Ti. While for our Ryzen 7 3700X, we have an Aorus X570 Elite motherboard, also 16GB of RAM, this time DDR4 and at 3000MHz, and also once again the GTX 1080 Ti. So, enough talking, let's go into some results. Starting with online results, where the general consensus is that in some games, such as CSGO, AMD is neck and neck with Intel, despite Intel's being generally regarded as the better CPUs for gaming. However, that is really where AMD's advantages end, and apart from that, not many games get higher FPS with Ryzen compared to Intel CPUs. But most people agree on the fact that it's probably to do with optimization, and those FPS will increase at least slightly as new game updates and drivers are released. Now let's get into some results I have, starting with Rainbow Six Siege at max settings. Here we have results for 1080, 1440 and 2160, so you can get a full picture of what your experience could be like on all three of the main resolutions. So as you can see, our poor FX didn't really fare too well compared to the Ryzen, but a few interesting things to note is that apart from the minimums going up, the FPS barely changed between the 1440 and 2160 resolutions. That is to be expected because higher resolutions are more GPU bound than CPU bound, but those higher minimums are a nice sight also. Moving on to Shadow of the Tomb Raider, which is a really great benchmark for this kind of review because it also gives specific CPU game and CPU render results using its benchmark tool, which is really great for comparing these. The story is pretty much just the same. A really decent bump up in 1080, a slight one in 1440, and pretty much none in 2160. But what's really interesting at is, even though the CPU scores in 2160 went through the roof, the FPS hasn't. They stayed as low as Intel stocks for the next few months, suggesting that we're pretty much GPU bound at that point. So as you can see, we get big improvements in both 1080 and 1440 compared to the FX 8350, but in 4K, the games pretty much don't care. So that got me thinking, what if it's the RAM? Because as you probably know, Ryzen is very dependent on the frequency of the RAM, and right now in my PC I'm only running 3000MHz RAM, so it's time to overclock it to 3200 and see what we get. So let's go back to our updated graphs now. 1080p pretty much didn't care about overclocked RAM apart from the minimums, which did go up substantially, while with 1440 and 2160 pretty much nothing has changed. But it definitely shows if you just overclock your RAM, you really don't need to have a top-notch graphics card to play games at a high FPS with a Ryzen 3000 at 1080p. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is a bit of a different story, as we see quite a substantial increase in FPS from our original 3700X results to the ones with overclocked RAM. The CPU scores have also greatly increased, suggesting that maybe for gaming, RAM isn't that important. However, for different CPU workloads, we're going to find that it makes way more of a difference. So we'll get back to that in a second. At 1440p, we see pretty much no difference when it comes to FPS, and the only real advantage the overclocked RAM gives the CPU here is a slightly higher CPU render score, while with 2160 things pretty much stay exactly the same, which is again to be expected. So let's try a completely different benchmark now. Let's try time SPI. With just regular time SPI, the difference is absolutely enormous, with the biggest thing contributing to a higher score is of course the CPU test, because on the previous system, that has been what's been really holding the score back. In time SPI Extreme, however, we naturally see way less of a difference because it is again more GPU bound. So then I repeated the same tests with the overclocked RAM to find some interesting results, and that is that our scores are actually lower once we overclock the RAM. And when compared to normal time SPI, it's down by over 100 points, which is quite a significant difference, suggesting that 3D Mark benchmarks may not be fully optimized to handle Ryzen 3000 yet. But that was all main to do with games. Let's move on to some different benchmarks, starting with Cinebench, where we see that the Ryzen 3700X absolutely destroys the FX 8350. When it comes to editing, however, there is also a great difference, as the FX 8350 struggled to even keep up a solid preview FPS at the lowest settings. While here, while I was using Hitroom Express, I can get away with much higher playback quality while still having really smooth FPS. So if you're a content creator who's still stuck with an old CPU, this should be reason enough to upgrade in my opinion. Although if even with medium playback settings, things do start to slow down when you just start adding in a few effects. So it's definitely not as good for that as something such as a Threadripper for example, but it's still a big improvement. Now let's talk thermals. For my PC, I'm using the AMD provided Wraith Prism cooler that comes with the 3700X. At idle, it sits roughly around 40 degrees. After hitting it with some time SPI, it came to rest somewhere between 67 degrees. And then when I used either 64 to stress test it, it landed somewhere at 96 degrees. So they aren't definitely the worst temperatures in the world, and also shows that the provided cooler is enough for most people unless you're planning to do some serious overclocking. But I'm gonna say something that I haven't really seen a single reviewer say so far, and that is that this launch is almost disappointing. Because think about this, yes, AMD has taken a huge lead in some areas, but these areas are the same ones they've been already leading in Ryzen 2000. For gaming on a budget, you go AMD. For content creation, you go AMD. And for gaming and content creation, you go AMD, same as before. And also, same as before, if you don't care about how much money you spend on your CPU, and you game a lot, you go with Intel. But that last one will change when the 3950X finally launches in September. Finally, knocking outright any value proposition Intel had left. And then, these CPUs will finally be able to hold the title of Intel killers. But that doesn't mean at all they are bad, because the kind of value proposition and performance to price ratio we have with these is one we haven't seen in ages. So then, the Ryzen 3000. It's pretty amazing. You get so much performance per dollar spent. They are good for pretty much anything you throw at it. And to finally answer the question, if you're still on an old CPU like me, I think this is finally the push we needed to upgrade. And it is all rather poetic, you know? Like, believe it or not, but this decade's almost over. Crazy, right? And these CPUs are like this decade's last hurrah. A showcase of how far technology has come in this decade and also what it is capable of nowadays. So, if you want to be ready for the computational challenges of the future and also showcase what technology this decade can be like, then this CPU is for you, and you have AMD to thank for that. Well, I have to thank my patrons, Dante, James Falzone, and Kraken. Thank you so much for supporting this channel, especially videos like this, because it's no exaggeration, this is definitely the most expensive video I did to date. So if you want to help me make more videos like this in the future that are just ridiculously expensive, then Patreon is the best way to do it. It's a link down below, and even $1 a month helps a lot to help me make better videos and also videos on more interesting topics. So let me know what you think of Ryzen 3000 down in the comments below. I can't stop gushing about how amazing these little CPUs are. So let me know what you think, and if you're getting one yourself, let me know which one you're getting, because there's quite a few to choose from. And also, I highly recommend you check out my Discord, which is down in the description below, where you can talk about Ryzen or anything else really, so join in the conversation there. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, remember to subscribe, like, whatever, and I'll see you all in whatever I make next. Goodbye, everyone. Goodbye.